So I'm Anthony Bernardo from IDBS, the Director of Governance, Compliance and Risk. And I work in the operations and quality team with Damien, um, really looking at the impact of regulations on what we do and the impact of those regulations on our customers and how we can support those. And also in terms of the risk that people face and the legal compliance across the different global regions.
So my name's Damien Tiller. I'm the quality manager at IDBS. I lead the GXP team focusing on GXP compliance in the e-workbook and other IDBS projects.
Hi, I'm Stuart Ward. I'm Director of Platform and Solutions here at IDBS, and I'm responsible for the eWorkbook GXP Cloud, essentially work within the product management group and look after that offering.
I'd say one of the main challenges facing pharmaceutical organisations today is the need to work efficiently, and that comes from working in different labs or even different buildings, potentially across different countries or borders, and adhering to the regulations that apply to those. One of the side effects of that is the need to generate large amounts of data and be able to share those quickly across large scopes of geographical space, and the increased amount of computing power that actually takes to do that. Many companies now are working globally and remotely, and that poses some additional challenges that wouldn't necessarily have been there previously. Another of the challenges is the mentality that we've always done it this way, which poses some issues when we're looking at new technologies that are coming in relation to the cloud and the way that we handle data security.
I think from my perspective, I'd just like to add bottom line is more organizations are having to do more with less. They're having to drive their business goals, and they're having to look at technology and to see how technology can support them to get to their business goals faster. So as organizations need more, cloud technology adapts to deal with that requirement. And equally, when they need less, they can dial that back. So it's very attractive to businesses that are constantly having to evolve and change, to turn to these technology capabilities to help them meet those needs.
I think also I'd add the perspective of the marketplace. So there's two sides to this. One is the need to collaborate. So companies will be working together with research organisations and with manufacturing organisations to outsource a lot of their work. Now, when that happens, they have to be sharing some of the data that they work on. So there's this concept of sharing information, not just across borders, but across organisational boundaries. And that's a new challenge when the IT systems may not be shared. Another facet of that is competition. So it's a competitive market, and there are organisations who are moving to the cloud quite aggressively, and they will start to see economic benefits of doing that. And there's a drive towards moving to the cloud, and customers will have to respond to that in order to stay competitive.
I think in terms of looking at the security, I think that we have to take a step back and we have to see what cloud is actually providing, what it does beyond maybe what could be produced on premise. In terms of the security aspect, the cloud companies, I think we can make the statement that the majority of cloud companies have more security experts looking at the various components that they provide. then perhaps an organization would have working on an on-premise environment essentially within their own company. I mean, if we just look at this in reality, you know, if these cloud components fail security, then yeah, as we've seen in some cases in the press, there could be big impacts to organizations. So it's not really, let's be honest here, it's not really in the interest of cloud providers to not focus on security. So it's their number one priority. The other thing that we have to look at here is when applications are created on the cloud, they take all of these components and bolt them together. So whilst the individual components are secure, when we bolt them together, we also have to make sure that the way that these components are put together are also providing a secure environment as well. And there are a number of things that can help us. There are the tools that are available via the cloud platform that look for suspicious activities. For example, logins that have come from an area where logins have never come from before, or suddenly an increased use of resource which is out of specification from what would be classed as the norm. So there are a whole host of tools available to make sure that as I said before, that there hasn't been any real suspicious activity on the system. The other aspect is, as vendors create applications using cloud technology, is to ensure that the vendor has the right controls in place as well to make sure that all these building blocks are working together, and there isn't the risk of data breaches, etc., are extremely low. And there are a number of processes in place to be able to do that. Again, there are tools, but there are also ways that organizations can be audited, to the point that some of the points that have been made earlier around the checks and balances. There are processes, for example, ISO 27001 and SOC 2, that have a framework that enable organizations and vendors to check that these right checks and balances in terms of security in place as well. So overall, I would argue that cloud can actually provide more security than necessarily could again more efficiently than could be provided within an on-premise environment.
I'd agree, and I'd like to draw out, you mentioned about the ability of cloud service providers to employ dedicated security specialists. And what's more, they can, within that field, they can specialize. So they can have specialists within that field whose job, full-time job, is to stay on top of that aspect of security, to ensure that servers are patched and those kinds of things, but also to interpret the emerging threats before they come to the domain itself. And that's something that only the largest companies with high degrees of specialization can offer. And you know, this is something they do as their full-time job rather than as an additional role. So that's a definite key benefit.
I think it might be worth pointing out as well things like the SOC 2 report and the audit that goes alongside it. Within a pharmaceutical company, for example, if you have the MHRA or FDA, whoever come on site to carry out audits, part of that would be to look at the internal security and systems that you have in place, but they generally are very short audit periods. So you might have 2 to 5 days, maybe 1 or 2 auditors, whereas something like the SOC report is taken over a 6-month period. So the initial period looks at the controls to make sure the companies that are hosting this information securely have the correct controls in place. They then also come back during that 6-month period to make sure they're working as they should be. So that provides a level of security to demonstrate that data is more secure than potentially the historic method of keeping it on site and those short, very point-in-time audits.
So something else that that you asked was around the concern when people hear about security incidents in the press, and that's obviously an important thing to consider. Something to bear in mind is that the majority of these incidents that when you look into them are not down to the cloud service provider itself or the infrastructure as a service frameworks, which tend to be highly secure. It's often down to how these things are configured. This is leading back to the way that Stuart was mentioning about bolting together. Is often that something was not configured correctly by the end user, and that leads to an end user posting data in an unsecure place. So the concern really should not be focused so much on the cloud service provider, who the security of the framework and the infrastructure is their bread and butter. The concern, it's really for us, all organizations, to look inwardly at how the end users are actually choosing to configure and use that and protecting the data.
Yeah, and I guess there's one thing else to add, just taking this and dovetailing to what you've just said, Anthony, about taking that inward look. One clear advantage or further advantage that the cloud has over other things that we may well use, if we're comparing this to, say, an on-premise setup, is a clear separation of duties.
Mm-hmm.
So, to your point, Anthony, it's where that end user could potentially put that data. But in reality, if you have the clear separation of duties in the similar way that the cloud provider has, so what I mean by clear, so maybe it's worth me just explaining what I mean by clear separation of duties. So within a cloud provider, the people that actually interact with the hardware do not know what is stored on that hardware. Equally, the people that know what is stored on that hardware, what is running on that hardware, don't know where that hardware is, or which particular physical machine is. So there's a separation between what those, certainly within the cloud provider, what those two users do. If you take that one step further, and in the case of, say, IDBS, where we're running software on or using a cloud provider as infrastructure as a service, and we're running applications on that, equally we are separated from those servers and how they are being operated. So there is a separation again between the physical versus the logical. And on top of that, from a customer, you've got your shall we say super users or end users. That customer are separated from actually the operation of the system. Now this has tremendous benefit, because it means that for significant sort of security events to occur, you probably need to have collusion between the various parties. So that's unlikely to occur with those three things. But equally, you can then focus each group's, want for a better word, responsibilities onto focusing that particular aspect of the overall system is not compromised in any particular way. So it provides essentially two benefits. Again, making some links to maybe what can be provided. This it is possible in providing this in other ways, say in an on-premise environment. But again, I would suggest that the cloud environment, that there are the actual gaps between the various roles are much clearer than they would perhaps be in an on-premise environment.
Yeah, I'd agree. I just wanted to clarify something there as well. You raised an interesting point, and I wanted to make sure there was no misunderstanding. So, one thing you mentioned about the segregation of duties, and about the people running or responsible for the data wouldn't know where it was. But I think what you mean is they don't have access to the hardware, the infrastructure where it's residing. And I think it's an interesting point that it's often misinterpreted by customers that they wouldn't know where their data was physically located, and that's a concern for them in the cloud. And I think there is a misunderstanding about the cloud, which comes from a time when people thought of the cloud as it's actually the metaphor of a cloud. It sounds diffuse, and that you don't know, your data can be spread out and you can't control where it is. When in fact that's not the case at all. With the cloud service providers, what they offer now and what's used and what IDBS use is highly configurable and controlled, so that you can absolutely lock down the region in which your data will be resident. It's not the case that you don't know where it is globally. You can say, I want my data to stay in this geopolitical region, or this country, or this state within this country, and that will be that's the standard of how it will work. So in terms of where the data is, you can control that. I just wanted to make that clarification.
It can be a challenge to interpret them. As you say, the GLP regulations, for example, were last updated in '97, long before technology was even capable of doing some of the things it is now, let alone the way that it's looking to move in the future. Regulators themselves are looking at it. So the MHRA, for example, on the 18th of February, released version 12 of Annex 1 for manufacturing sterile products. And that's looking at acknowledging the advances in technology. Within organizations, it's a case of interpreting it and making sure that the interpretations meet the technology while still meeting the requirements for the regulations. For example, looking at something like a GLP study report, the expectation in there is that you specify the location of the data. Historically, that would have meant the file or the lab book or wherever that data physically was stored. In the new world and with the new technology, that could mean the URL, it could mean the cloud, it could mean the databases, several different ways for that data to be interpreted and that meaning to be interpreted. And it's ensuring consensus between organizations and the regulators that we understand these and we can ensure that we are providing our customers with the means to meet those requirements.
Let me just pick up a couple of things that you said, Damien. I think we absolutely need to make it clear around the regulations that no regulation, certainly that I'm aware of, says that you can't use the cloud. And to be fair, many of the regulatory bodies, such as the FDA, the MHRA, etc., have come out with guidance on how the use of cloud should be interpreted with the regulations. And bottom line, it comes down to essentially a risk assessment. Can you provide essentially the same level of service on the cloud as could you do with shall we say more traditional technologies? I think the other part that we need to consider around this is the point that you brought up. For example, the location of where the data is, and really, I guess, two aspects around what that really means. One is from a legal aspect, so where is that data located, and in which country, which political region, geopolitical region is that data located in? Because at the end of the day, these are all underpinned, the regulations are underpinned by governing laws and things like that. So you need to understand how that fits in. And to be clear on the location within the cloud environment, you can choose where your data is stored, which country, which region. So I think that's covered. In the other aspect of location of where my data is you touched on it, is those regulations were originally written when perhaps the data was being captured on paper,
Mm-hmm.
or data could only be accessed using a single computer terminal. So you needed to know where, it was on a hard drive sitting in some locked, in some room with a single computer terminal. And so having the location of where that was incredibly important. Certainly if regulators wanted to go and visit and see where that data was, they wanted to know the location, or they do want to know where the location where they should go and sit. Clearly, as technology has moved on, and to the point there, technology's moved on faster than what the in many cases than where the regulations, what they're asking for, and I should add, for the better. Now we're really looking at is where can I go and access that data? Where can I go and see that? And I would suggest that actually the cloud makes it much easier to go and see that data, since it makes it more available on perhaps more than one computer terminal, or more than one system.
Another point just wanted to draw out from what Damien originally was saying, in terms of, and Stuart in fact, in terms of the risk assessment and the interpretation of the regulations. So the regulations are subject to interpretation by customers, and this is often where the concern can arise in terms of whether they can meet those regulations in a cloud system. And the fact is that many customers do that. They do the risk assessment, they do the interpretation, and they feel comfortable with that, and they go ahead and they use the cloud-based system. And we know of customers who have regulatory inspection and they come through with flying colours. So I think, again, going back to the market pressure, the customers that are able to invest in the risk assessment and the interpretation and satisfy themselves that the cloud is a safe and good place for their data will have a competitive advantage. And so I think it's incumbent on all of us to be able to do the intelligent interpretation of the regulations and actually realize those benefits. And I feel that customers that aren't able to do that are going to be left behind. I mean, the market is going into the cloud. That's happening. The question is how fast, and who will be left behind.
If you do take some of these regulations, and for example, archiving data, archiving of data, preservation of data, so the controls, disaster recovery and those types of things, then I guess to the points that Anthony and Damien have both mentioned up to this moment, the cloud environment, because it's easy to replicate data, because it's easy to set up very robust backup strategies, and also strategies where the downtime, so if an event does occur, the downtime to getting that system back up and running is minimized, because in many cases it's just an automatic switch over to a backup system. Equally, because you've got scalable computing resource and storage resource, creating rolling backups. So let's say an event occurs and you need to roll back the system to a point in time. Again, the cloud makes it very, very easy, essentially very, very easy to do this. So in many cases, the way the requirements, the regulatory requirements are written, cloud essentially provides that and much more. So I would argue that in terms of a data integrity point of view and a data security point of view, cloud takes data storage and regulatory data storage to the next level. And to the points that have already been made, that itself adds, competitive advantages to the customers that decide to embrace this technology.
So personally, I would say some of the good practices are similar to normal regulatory standards. You have things like ISO, so there's ISO 27001, which covers information security. There's also the SOC and SOC 2 standard, which I touched on a little bit earlier, which covers things like the controls around the availability, the integrity, the security of the data. And these provide a level of adherence and a level of just transparency potentially to customers that they wouldn't necessarily get if they came for a 1 or 2 day audit. The reports specify exactly how this data is controlled, the procedures and processes that are in place to ensure that the data is as secure as it can possibly be, unlike potentially ISO that would just list out whether you've passed or failed. SOC 2, for example, would list out all of the controls, and it would list out any non-exceptions to any of them for the customer, which gives them a level of insight they just wouldn't naturally get otherwise.
Yes, I think that's right. I mean, it's the transparency, isn't it? It's the visibility the customer gets directly into the heart of the system that they want to inspect, and the way that the SOC 2 controls are structured is it will draw out the important aspects for the consumer rather than it being sort of hidden behind a lot of technical jargon. It really draws it out for them and it gets everything out on the table and lets them take a look. So that transparency is an innovative thing, I think, that people are able to see that level of detail. I think the other parts with these standards, there are emerging and have emerged over the last few years. These generally recognised standards. There is obviously ISO 27001, fairly generic but very useful, very commonly understood. SOC 2, as Damien pointed out, and then there's the Cloud Security Alliance provides a checklist which is called the Consensus Assessments Initiative Questionnaire, shortened to CAKE. And the great thing about this is it goes into great detail, and it enables consumers to look, it enables customers to compare providers across a very large number of points, which go into quite specific detail about the security measures. And what's great here is the fact that it's a consistent standard that many providers will complete and offer. So there's never been so much transparency. There's never been so much ability to really look at the technical detail and compare two providers like for like. And I think that puts a lot of power in the hands of the customer. And it is something that if customers can become familiar with that, they can really use that to give themselves a lot of assurance.
We can discuss it. I mean, we can. But I think there are some key things. I mean, the key thing that's really come out of the current incident with coronavirus is it's perhaps forcing organizations that are maybe traditional in their ways and to look at how technology can actually make their businesses more efficient in many ways, to embrace new technologies and do that investigation perhaps that they've been putting off for a while. Because let's be honest, we've all been forced to essentially change our working practices, and this, just really to me highlights people can do it. People can look at but equally, with technology, the way that their data's stored is if nothing else, if this just makes organizations just question, should they be doing something in a slightly different way to get that competitive advantage, to get that efficiency that their businesses require, then that will be a positive that has come out of the current situation that we're in.
It's a slight tangent from what Stuart was saying, but it just it reminded me of a story from my past, actually, in a previous lab environment, and the ability to work remotely. There was a situation where I had to travel to the office on a Saturday morning just to release a lab book so the laboratory staff can continue working. Whereas if the organization was using the cloud and using the technology that we have in place today, it would be as quickly as logging in, pressing a button, and releasing it, and they could continue working. They wouldn't have to wait the hour commute to get to the laboratory. They wouldn't have had to pay for someone for 2 to 3 hours to come in and do that. So it would have expedited that research rather than having to wait 3 hours before they could actually get going. It would have been a 30-second process. So it's another benefit of the cloud.
I think, yeah, and also, I mean, talking about the coronavirus, we're under a lockdown here in the UK, and it's interesting to think about the actual practical side of it. Is that companies that will have a purely cloud infrastructure, their IT departments will be able to work from home. They won't have to go into the office and maintain their own server room. So that's a whole range of critical employees who are not being put at risk. They're able to work remotely, they're able to maintain social distancing, and they're able to complete all the activities they need to do. The customers, the companies who will still have an on-premise solution will be in the uncomfortable position of having to decide whether to reduce their level of support, their internal service levels, because they don't want to put the IT staff at risk of going into the office environment, or to send them in, put them at risk, and to maintain the service levels. Companies who have gone purely cloud won't have to make that difficult decision.